Vagrant Story, Hobo Tale, Bum Chronicle. You know, the character designer here, Akihiko Yoshida, also did Nier Automata's 2B. I'm sure that's a coincidence. Vagrant Story is one of the PSX greats. Allegedly. It hits hard and sizzles, steak in a pan. Kinda chewy though. It defies genre, plays a little weird, kinda like a melee Parasite Eve. Maybe 10% of the audience knows what that means, making this analogy. Now, I've run it twice and happen to think it's pretty good, but the classic JRPG community, writ large, likes to, lead with the positives, because while the game gets evangelized up and down the tubes, it is not fit for human consumption. Rare steak means 2 to 3 minutes each side, maybe less, and well, this is overdone. You goofed it. Regardless, the game handles visuals, cutscenes, writing, and drama in an awe-inspiring way, enough to carry the slog. It's complex, but I very bizarrely have a teaching diploma, so I'll set you straight. Or something like that.
I run, you give chase. I am the heart and you the hunter.
Latent feelings. Awakening. What is this power?
Anyway, like I said, slaps frame 1. We get a cutscene depicting a nighttime raid on some baron's estate. It's moody and grim. The blonde knight here is hunting for someone named Sydney. We cut to the protag, Ashley Riot, moving through the estate grounds. It's one of the most dramatic intros in video games, something straight out of film. And when Ashley slips up, alerting the guards, we're thrust into combat. No tutorial, no hand-holding. You'd best have read that manual on the car ride back from GameStop, or so help me. Carving through, we cut to a pair of kidnappers, Sydney and his lackey Hardin. Ashley interrupts and puts a bolt through Buddy's chest, but gets knocked down when he turns his attention to Hardin. Apparently, Sydney's a little more than human. In true villain form, the guy calls down a dragon to cover his getaway while we're stuck fighting to live. Man, this game is awesome. You just know some twerp is chewing their fingernails like, was the dragon just waiting up there? Yup. It's called drama, sweetie, pipe down. All of this action quickly communicates the political nature of the conflict, complicated by 3 factions. Mulenkamp, or Sydney's cult, the Order of the Crimson Blades, basically the martial branch of the church, and the Valendia Knights of Peace, or VKP, who ultimately dispatch Ashley alongside another agent, Merlos, to chase after Sydney into the city of Leamon to rescue the kidnapped child, the Baron's son. That's a lot of moving parts, a lot of nouns, but Vagrant Story is so precise, and measured with its intro, it taps the player directly into that crucial dramatic vein to keep interest high. Except eventually, you gotta play Vagrant Story. About a year ago, talking to a friend, I mentioned that Vagrant Story is so tragic because all that story, all that beautiful cinematic framing, is trapped in the confines of this particular game. I didn't change my mind on playthrough 2. And I like JRPGs, I like weird stuff. I'm the Knights in the Nightmare guy. I know pain. And Kino, but that's besides the point. And I'm telling you, either let the thing beat you with hammers until you're sufficiently molded to the experience, or get online and get reading, because the mid-game spike will filter you if you're not ready. Vagrant Story is played in real time, running through corridors and hopping on platforms, admiring weathered buildings and dingy halls. It's an opulent PSX gem. Despite the relatively active play, combat is effectively turn-based. Drawing your sword initiates combat mode, which slows you down so you can't effectively kite enemies around. Damn developers. Being intelligent. And so, most fights turn into pause, select, attack slugfest. It's kind of like playing a fighting game on horrible Wi-Fi. It looks a little complex, but in practice, it's simple enough. Hitting a button will freeze time and conjure a sphere, visualizing your effective range. You can strike an enemy in that range. Easy. Usually with a melee weapon and sometimes with a bow, and eventually you'll have magic as well. And no worries if you're thinking, but how do I play optimally? The game will tell you, numerically even, what the best course of action is against any single enemy. None of that is a problem. The basics of combat are simple and clean. The issues start with menu management, the risk meter, buff and debuff juggling, and fiddly equipment crap, but we'll get into it later. Just know that if you're having a hard time, it's not a lack of skill necessarily, it's a lack of knowledge, and the game's not about to share notes. Otherwise, the rest of the play is light platforming and box puzzles. Okay, it's not that box puzzles are bad, but you know, I've seen Link do it, I've seen Raziel do it. Bro, I've seen some box puzzles. Maybe we could do some pogo stick puzzles like a Q-Birder, do some mini games, right? Knock out the patrol with a weird first-person stealth segment, or bounce a quarter 3 feet off Ashley's ass. I need some fresh air. Let's get out of here. Oh my god. Leomond is such an incredible setting, perfectly capturing a dioramified version of pastoral France. For real, the majority of the game takes place in this fantastical, polygonal approximation of Saint-Emilion, a small town known for its wine. As for dioramification, director Yasumi Matsuno made plenty of World War II scenes in his youth. Had to be that war. In university, there was a guy we called the Red Baron. He argued with the professors a lot and breathed really heavy and knew a concerning amount about a certain political party and their values. I wonder what that guy's doing now. Probably calling in bomb threats at abortion clinics. So, setting any kind of strange World War II obsession aside, Vagrant Story's general construction makes a lot of sense. The world is effectively parceled into a string of rooms, each with a unique name.
Let's see, Bandits Hollow, wait, work, then die? I mean, Matsuno, that is a little on the nose.
And you're often battling, room by room, hacking a bloody path to Sydney. Matsuno managed to transpose his childhood hobby into a video game, directing an original Square Enix project. Sir, your crown awaits. That's how you know the art's good, when it's an exploratory piece informed by intersecting mediums. This shit is so cool. Vagrant Story is an aesthetic triumph for the PSX, regardless of fidelity. The stylistic choices, woven into every inch of the experience, landed in a tier of its own. There's plenty of most beautiful PS1 games lists, and a bunch of them are missing Vagrant Story, which means those lists were written by posers. Check out the scenery, man. Check out the attention to detail. Look at that lighting technique to simulate realistic lighting. Look at the lighting in general. This game's from 2000. Surreal. I don't think the game would be remembered half as well if not for the details. I think Vagrant Story sticks so strongly in the minds of the people who played it because of these elements. The characters, the story, every prop and pillar. All the dressing. And that's the only real problem I have with it. Gameplay, as distinct from the aesthetic stuff. It feels like filler. Like a really tired formality you must first address before reaching the payoffs. I guess you could always get the PC edition and aggressively cheat through combat, but you lose some of the charm that way. The gameplay sells a very valuable narrative that would be lost if ignored. But don't worry, I brought my dusty teaching degree. So, first things first. Game's got a little crust. If you don't eat your crust, you're 5. And I don't appreciate children hanging around here. Go play Minecraft with Irate Gamer, apparently. What? Despite the clunk, I respect what the gameplay communicates to the player, the ludonarrative harmonies it dabbles in, that sort of junk. Did I just lampshade that? Excuse me. That sort of godly design. Aside from just slashing, you're quickly allowed to combo enemies with skills that you can assign to the other face buttons, giving you a basic attack and 3 special moves. Stuff like restore HP on hit, restore MP on hit, add 50% damage onto base damage, those kind of things. The trick is you have to time combos, and any misinput will cut the combo off wholesale. So you've got to be really deliberate about how you attack. And if you're wondering, yeah, that means you can combo infinitely if your timing's good. Though most combo abilities don't deal quality damage, but still, good rhythm equates to breaking action parity in your favor. It's how you create advantage. So get on the DDR and hit that yoinky sploinky while your enemies watch. In horror. This timing element also matters for a set of reactive defense abilities, like shrugging off some damage or reflecting it. They're hard to time right, but can save so many battles. It's nuts. Straight up save you from one-shot kills. So it's worth getting into that stuff early. I love the timing elements of combat because it flawlessly illustrates one of the major design conceits driving the experience: pace. That might sound stupid, but if the intro is any indication, with its intelligent visuals and efficient framing, Vagrant Story wants to be a tight experience, well cropped, and rhythmic combat meshes aesthetically with that idea. And for a while, it works. The problem is, by the mid-game, combat is drawn out massively because of the system's general clunk, and delivered room by room like a genuine dungeon crawl. It takes all the excitement, the electrifying energy, and snuffs it, wraps it up in menus, and dumps it off a cliff. Comboing rhythmically would be great, except once you get it down, you start building this risk counter. Every swing ticks it up. The higher your risk, the higher your damage, and the lower your chance to hit. No big deal, 50% chance to hit. Doesn't matter if you're schmoovin' on dudes like a human stump grinder, but Vagrant Story happens to care a lot about weapon type, weapon strength, and various affinities. Having solid stats matters just about as much as your grasp on the mechanics. Traveling through the game, and usually by accident, players will end up extremely underpowered with garbage gear because they weren't exceedingly thorough, searching every room of every area, and often won't know about weapon crafting and its intricacies because it's insane and convoluted. Oh yeah, you can fire off special moves. That's a special move. It's not that bad, a vagrant veteran cries. It's totally reasonable. Just go on, Vagrant Story is a game where you have to combine two blades of the same kind, one higher quality and one the immediate lower step in quality, to achieve the next level of blade quality. But also there's a second stream of qualities that doesn't interact with the other. It also hides those upgrade pieces away in obscure mid to late game locations more often than not, so you're either made to hunt through the dungeons, or go find a guide, or farm. My favorite JRPG activity. Afterwards, you have to disassemble the weapons you find, which you should be doing anyway for valuable slottable gems for your current gear, so you can reassemble things like 10 hours later in-game after acquiring. It's honestly insane, because a standard issue action game might have just worked better. This is a huge ask out of average players, right? And it doesn't let up. Vagrant Story only gets more difficult and demanding as the quest unfolds with frequently upgrading enemies. You'll hit a point where your weapons won't even register damage on enemies. Any of them, edged, piercing, or bludgeoning, the game will just say 0 damage. And you gotta cope with that. Now, it's important to chill out a bit when you see that stuff. Throughout the game, you'll collect spells, and 4 in particular are mandatory, though they're trickled to the player over about 18 hours. Prostasia, Heracles, Degenerate, and Tarnish. The first 2 will target your strength and gear quality, and the second pair will ruin those stats for whoever you target. Oh, and elemental affinities can be buffed with gems or magic as well. But the point is that you'll often be stuck casting 4 spells by the late game to ensure you're being as efficient as possible before ever taking a swing. In a game with menus this clunky, in a game with spells this slow. Believe me, I know plenty about taking too long to get to the content. I used to run my little theme song before the video. Yeah, you like that? When's this gonna end, right? Vagrant Story hits the ground running and routes the player into a whole-ass swamp. And giving up means admitting defeat, missing the story. It filters the weak for fun and forges fans under extreme pressure. Teaches them mastery by forcing them to fend for themselves in a world without respite. Teaches them pride in a world that must be charted and sifted through. Thoroughly understood to complete. It's an abominable train wreck of a play, but gratifying to beat. Something like No Nut November. Individual enemies complicate combat, like setting aside teleporting splorch creatures and unhittable treasure chest silverfish and annoying flitting so you're desperately pausing and unpausing against to land a first strike or risk a status ailment. Sorry, still unnutted here. We're mildly tense. Enemies all have particular weaknesses, like one of the 3 major weapon types, edged, piercing, or blunt, on top of their actual type and elemental affinity, human or undead, etc. And every weapon has a weapon type and a list of affinities, so you'll know what weapon hits what well, but maybe algorithmically that number doesn't stack up against said enemy's edge resistance, and so you'll be fiddling around like a dumb asshole in your weapon belt, rifling through menus so you can check how good this or that particular weapon is against that particular enemy. So many fights are predicated on full-scale background checks, obnoxious trial and error, all before before a single sword swings. Usually, getting a good edged weapon carries huge portions of the game, but you can't rely on one weapon all the time, or that you'll be able to consistently upgrade your major weapon types unless you're extremely thorough with exploration. At least there's some good. If you rub off the grime, enemies often want the player striking specific weak points. I love dragon fights in this game because fire breath is scary, and you've got like half a second to run forward, jump past its effective range, right under its nose, and hack at its neck. Or say its tail is weak to your best weapon, so it turns into a tug-of-war, chasing the tail while wrangling the uncooperative AI. Sussing out a weak point that corresponds to a specific blade type, piercing damage in the giant crab's mouth, for example, that's the stuff that makes you feel like a genius. It may be clunky as and frustrating as hell, but learning this stuff yourself is rewarding. The play accurately meshes with the scenario. You're a guy, with amnesia by the way, made to track down some dude in a city crawling with monsters. Things that people have never seen, with no support and no safety. You find what you can, craft your equipment up, and learn to survive in this crumbling hellscape. That's a cool harmony, okay? That said, sometimes it's not even the combat. Sometimes the world itself filters players. I mentioned box puzzles, and some of them are just demented. I've made fun of Golden Sun in the past for having puzzles that amount to performing the highest number of actions on the existing set pieces in any given puzzle, even when it's completely obvious how to proceed, and calling that a puzzle. But Vagrant Story might be pushing it a little too far the other way. You'll find yourself entering and exiting rooms plenty of times to get them right, unless you've got the puzzle solutions loaded up on YouTube. Yeah, here's a shout out, bro. You earned it! Some of the individual levels are problematic too. Snowfly Forest may be a beautiful space with an evocative name, but I never want to step foot here again. Seriously, forcing the player to trudge through one of those exits teleport you into strange places dungeons with respawning enemies in this combat system is another level, another plane of cruel. Oh, and the enemies here are both weak to different types of weapons, and they're both hard to hit consistently. You're better off just running and healing. Love that. Love that for me. There's this one segment you gotta do timed, and most people can't get all the treasures in it without doing the whole thing a couple of times. Maybe 3 if you're unlucky. We're not gonna talk about that one. But whatever. Every JRPG has that dungeon or that fight. This is nothing new. Pain is old as time. That's a pretty f***ed up kind of seg, huh? And now, a genuine love letter to Vagrant Story's characters, plot, and general construction. Yasumi Matsuno's one of the greats. Not to downplay his team, and I'll get to them later, but the guy knows what he wants and it kicks ass. Fire writ upon the page and lightning in frame. The plot has similarities to predecessor Final Fantasy Tactics. It takes place in a future Ivalice and it's packed with violence. Powerful characters pit themselves against each other, and a web of political intrigue hangs over the plot's events, though the player probably won't understand why this or that party are at odds during a first play. Ashley, Sydney, and Guildenstern are the 3 major players, so let me do some background work. Ashley spends most of the game hunting for Sydney on orders from the VKP. He's a risk breaker, a fakey JRPG term for someone whose job involves busting up criminal organizations and threats to the security of society writ large. He suffers from memory loss, but recovers previously learned risk breaker abilities over time as his backstory unfolds through interactions with Sydney and another risk breaker, Rosencrantz. Bro, these guys aren't secret police. Ashley's a stripper and Rosencrantz is a bondage slave. Merlos, the VKP Inquisitor from the beginning, is quickly captured and ferried throughout the game by Sydney and Hardin, the 2 on-screen members of Mulenkamp, Sydney's cult. Hardin's basically a guy with a little magic, but Sydney has powers ranging from summoning to bewitchment, basically light mind control or illusion type stuff, and he's apparently unkillable. It's okay, give him the Kamehameha, like a Gundam or something. Maybe a lightsaber, and a harem, and a key to the city, and a subway gift card. Sydney moves through Leamond in search of something we're not privy to until the endgame, manipulating Ashley and the Blades, and we're only fed hints about his quest via Ashley's ability to scry through other people's eyes, an ability he can't easily control, and Merlot's own ability to read the hearts of others, giving us occasional exposition about Hardin and the kid. That means most of what we're fed about Sydney comes filtered through what we hear and see from other characters, things that Sydney resists in just about every scene he's in. He wears illusion like a cloak, so we don't ever feel confident in what we know about him until the endgame. Scrying is a helpful little narrative device because Sydney functionally drives the plot. It moves with him, so Ashley needs a way to key into the action. Otherwise, this would all happen off-screen, unseen, while Ashley plods through cellars and mines. That'd be a snore. Romeo Guildenstern harasses Sydney for the most part, but we're mostly stuck cleaning up his lackeys. The character's not bad. It's cool to have a competing harrier, a second set of crosshairs on the stag. It's someone to violently compete with. Like you'd expect in a game from the creators of FFT, the church is not to be trusted. They're just as dangerous as the monsters you face, but the genuine human pathos makes them exciting to battle. So in case it isn't obvious, the characters give me sweats. Make me want to plan a Vagrant Story Dungeons & Dragons campaign. I mean, this is spicy stuff. But it's not just the actors, right? It's the unique confluence of action film cutscenes dripping with drama and sweat and the endless weave of the game's mysteries. One scene, it's Ashley's backstory. Next scene, we're learning about the ancient runes carved into the walls. There's a psychotic troll monster, Zong!
Why does Sydney's tattoo make me feel things?
It's an absolute masterclass in juggling threads, concepts, subplots, and nouns. The kind of story that's impossible to replicate on a whim because it's so finely crafted. Vagrant Story borrows a lot from film as a medium, which one side of me might call cowardice, bowing to the conventions of another, more established medium, but that'd be an unfair criticism when the value of applying filmography techniques lies in capturing capital A action to complement the story on offer. It floats those story time bombs, Ashley's past, Sydney's intentions, the internal drama of the Crimson Blades so effortlessly, while the gameplay gums things up significantly, enough that you might forget previous beats and nouns. It's easy to get invested regardless. I personally don't like commentating the plots of games much, funny considering the Xenoblade video, but shut up. But I think it's worth pulling examples. So, we learn about magic before ever entering Leomon proper through a pair of soldiers that mention anyone with a grimoire can sling spells. That's how the game introduces the grimoires, a series of spellbooks, usually earned for killing a boss, that expand Ashley's ability pool. No tutorial, nothing clumsy, just some eavesdropping, a boss fight, and an item pickup. There's your magic. Soon after, Sydney approaches Ashley, Merlot's in tow, setting the stage for a chase, but manages to instill doubt in the player by presenting Ashley's backstory, watching his wife and child die to a pair of bandits. Kind of a strange thing to show the player. Sydney accuses Ashley of having no soul, and we're led to believe he's a broken man, a ruthless secret agent with a tragic past.
I forgot he flew away.
Ashley's risk-breaker abilities are unsealed here, abilities he's presumably forgotten about. It implicitly tells the player that there's more to uncover, both mechanically and regarding the player character. Entering Leomon, we learn tidbits about the dark nature of the city, meet Guildenstern and his subordinates, and kill one of them after the rest depart. However, Guildenstern's been observing the battle and simply walks away. Injects a seedling about the city itself, we assassinate a guy, and his boss just leaves. In case you're not counting, that's 2 mysteries in a single scene. A lot of Sydney's scenes are interesting for the reasons I outlined earlier, but also because his motives are fairly unclear. A ghostly version of the little boy, presumably a result of Merlot's ability to read hearts, tells us that Sydney intends to die. If you see an adventure like this, you have to tell me! Romeo and Samantha are going over ancient runes and discussing the ultimate grimoire, the Grand Grimoire, when Sydney shows up to f with Romeo for fun. We actually watch Sydney back down to Guildenstern. And that's fascinating because we've been led to believe that Sydney's basically fearless, but not completely. For all his magic, he's still a relatively frail person. Despite his sardonic mockery, we don't want this prep to win. We're clearly meant to be rooting for Sydney. Even fairly irrelevant scenes like Romeo slapping Samantha, who's been scribed through by Ashley, serve a greater purpose in the grand narrative. In this case, it's a hefty piece of foreshadowing, but before we can think about it too long, this dude Jan Rosenkrantz, apparently another VKP risk breaker, starts spouting off about Leomon being a wellspring. We're not meant to trust him, so Ashley doesn't. Later, the other remaining Guildenstern lackey, Grissom, faces Sydney down and taps into dark magic, an act that could have killed him, to summon a demon. We team up with Sydney, affirming through play that Sydney is not the true villain, and obliterate Grissom in the coolest fight of the game. Like, teaming up with Virgil, man. Dudes, stay rockin'. We're rewarded with Sydney's version of the truth. Ashley killed his own family, and the VKP planted false memories in him. Shaken, but in far too deep to pull out. Literally, this part of the map is so frustratingly remote, man. I ain't hauling ass through that forest twice. We're left with only one option: moving forward. Another Romeo and Samantha scene reveals that the entire city of Leomond is a magic circle. Gulp sound effect. Rosencrantz pops in for some cheeky insults. Everyone knew it was a magic circle, big boy. Yeah, man, totally. And Ashley walks in. The Riskbreakers battle, and Ashley beats Jan back, so we're fed an even fuller version of Ashley's backstory. Ashley and Jan worked together as VKP stooges once and killed a young family thinking that they were a threat, somehow. But let's not ask questions about that. Stricken with grief, but immeasurably useful to the organization, the VKP used magic to construct a false identity for the Riskbreaker and suppressed Ashley's true memories. More than that, Jan reveals that Sydney is preparing Ashley as a vessel for the darkness, and nobody knows why. Whether compelled by the utter hollowness of his existence, his suppressed emotions, the player at the steering wheel, or his new boyfriend, Ashley continues on in spite of everything. You see what I mean about constant threads, yeah? It's worth mentioning that offering a new version of Ashley's backstory every 5 hours isn't the hardest sell. He's easily the least interesting character on screen, but Ashley's so often cast aside, literally hiding behind walls so consistently, and scrying through others. I think Matsuno knew. After all, why interrupt the actors on their little stage when we've got nothing to contribute? Ashley only waltzes on screen when it's time to pick up the controller. It's almost comical, but I think awesome cutscenes are a solid reward for slogging through lines and junk. Vagrant Story, 2-for-1 play and play. After some direct exposition about Sydney, courtesy of Merlot's heart-reading trick, Romeo and a subordinate blast Harden in the chest, and we learn that Romeo's using dark magic. He says not to underestimate the Cardinal. Very Matsuno play. Everybody Romeo reads Harden's heart, and we learn that Sydney is the key to everything. And that key is on his back, the tattoo of the rude inverse, or inverted cross for human beings. Rosencrantz confronts Sydney, and I love that because it gives Sydney someone to clown on. Buddy's built up for most of the game, but really only dicks around with Sydney or gets spooked by Guildenstern and runs. So watching this cocky jackass cut off Sydney's arm, only for the guy to say, "Oh yeah, well, see, the thing about that is, I already sacrificed my limbs to the gods." It's pretty good. You gotta reinforce that your characters are worth the statues underpaid laborers have to mold the bulge on. Unfortunately, Sydney's confronted by Guildenstern, and while he manages to teleport Merlot's, Harden, and the kid to safety, he's no match for the Templar. And fair enough. Guy's dabbling in the dark arts. He's able, he's healthy, unlike whatever's going on with that skin tone dude. My guy, your vitamin D is wretched. Romeo plans to purify the land of sinners and rule by fear, creating an orderly society. But since he's your typical self-righteous, dark-dabbling powermonger, we know he's scum. He even carves the tattoo off Sydney's back. It's disgusting. I mean, incredible image, really evocative stuff. This guy gets it. Cheers for Matsuno, man. I'm hooting. We meet with Sydney, steal our resolve, and head into the finale. Matsuno has a pattern of irreverent or suspicious depictions of religious institutions, but that often extends to the state apparatus as well. It's probably more accurate to say that he's suspicious of power and those who seek it. And true to that conceit, the dark, the magic seeding Leomond, corrupts and destroys those who seek it, even once decent men. It's why Sydney chose Ashley to, quote, succeed the darkness in Leomond, because he's so pure, he would not misuse the darkness like most others. I think that's poorly conveyed by the play, a game largely about slashing through increasingly powerful enemies, crafting better gear by hand, and choosing to both read grimoires and consume stat-boosting items to topple the game's challenges. Power up. But at least Ashley's sufficiently stony and reactive as opposed to proactive on screen to justify that read of his character. The battle is long and frustrating, but if you got this far, it's just another weed to pull, so Vagrant Story wraps up most of its threads. Romeo is destroyed, Hardin dies of his wounds, Merlos takes the kid home, Duke, Bardorba, and Sydney die together, having fulfilled their last quest. Something most players probably won't understand on first play, and that's okay. The game is made to be played multiple times through New Game Plus. Ashley walks off into the darkness, the eternal vagrant, even leaving mysteries for the final scene. Oh, you. I have some threads to tie myself. I think Vagrant Story does such a good job of wrapping the player up into the experience, the on-screen action, that it potentially loses players on some of the value underpinning the work. Let's talk about the team behind Vagrant Story for a moment. Every major player contributed to major Square projects or other Matsuno games, ranging from Ogre Battle to Tactics Ogre to Final Fantasy Tactics. It's why Vagrant Story is so immediately recognizable for fans of FFT. It's built on those bones, especially narratively. But hey, same lead, same fingerprints. Aside from Matsuno, Jun Akiyama handled event direction. He worked previously on FFT and would move on to FFTA, Kingdom Hearts 1, and others. It's kind of surprising that he worked on those particular games, because Vagrant Story's events really pop. But fair enough. The lead composer, Hitoshi Sakamoto, also did FFT, though he was asked to create a soundtrack like no other for Vagrant Story, so we get an OST that flits between the antiquated plin-plons of FFT to straight out of X-Files. I'm not even kidding about that. That's a real thing. He'd eventually compose for a million crappy licensed anime games like Battle Stadium Dawn, among others, and many other successful games as well. I mentioned the character designer Akihiko Yoshida, whose work is highly evocative in more than one way. This is a pseudo-medieval, low-fantasy setting, and dudes out here showing full cheek, whole chest, and that's not armor. That isn't even cosplay, bro. What are you doing? I'm thinking this dude and the guy behind Castlevania Judgment's redesign should, hang out. Maybe draw together, you know? Just a thought. Hiroshi Minagawa, also from FFT, Ogre Battle, etc., handled the game's art direction, from character model supervision to the menus and layout. I've had to see this dude's menus so much, it's hard to compliment, but it's worthwhile having an artist you trust to bring about your little vision, you know? This guy's been around since Ogre Battle? I love that Matsuno had his little clan, his little design guild for a while. Vagrant Story is the kind of title that feels like it could have flopped entirely, come out so much worse. It's really easy to criticize with a modern eye, but the value should be plain. The artistry, the enthusiasm bleeds through the tapestry, no matter how old and weathered. Overlooking a few minor design quirks, dissonances, that sort of thing, it's an incredibly intelligent game that manages to whip up a tailwind to carry the player through some truly challenging play. And it's a niche experience, an unexpectedly artsy piece that's just interesting and just difficult enough to whip up a dedicated fan base. I mean, do the math. Complex characters and background information presented through a script that you've got to read every line to get the gist of. Borderline obnoxious, repetitive, yet timing-sensitive, and inherently engaging combat against foes whose weaknesses you've got to memorize to efficiently churn through. Confusing map layouts with hidden secrets and New Game Plus to burn through it all again, fully equipped. Vagrant Story forges that kind of fan, the know-it-all, the splainer. And I don't even think that's a problem. Even if it's a spawning ground for gamerism, it earns its fans with its sheer quality. Cause yeah, I'm not sitting here like, damn, you know, Ashley Riot's story really changed my life, but I'm fascinated by the moving parts. My brain wants to replicate this, transpose this story, thieve it. So many game stories prance around and waste time, which works in different contexts, but this shit hits you so hard you'll be dazed through the boring bits. Surely, spectacle and vibes are enough to establish a game. For example, Chrono Cross. And yeah, maybe Ashley was a bit of a stump, but he's a competent guy working through trauma. He's destroyed by his own actions, they're shunted far into the back of his mind, and he literally awakens to them over the course of the game as he levels up and gains self-assuredness, until he's finally able to look at the truth and decide for himself what his past means for his future. He's not some meaningless shell of a personality. There's an arc there that I think a lot of people can resonate with, even if it's something you don't recognize immediately. Matsuno may be known for explicitly political works, but I think Vagrant Story is a profoundly human tale. We're all processing our trauma, even if we don't want to admit it. We're all working through way more shit than anyone should. Seriously, how is all this shit here? And we're all going. getting through it, and nobody's coming to save us. It's down to us alone. The people we meet are hard to understand, and we only catch glimpses of them at a time. We prop them up in boxes and portraits in our mind, fading, fleeting scenes, compartmentalizations. It's all a lot easier fighting for something or someone, and when we find a person who gets us, we can learn, reflect. Growth doesn't have to be all cold discipline, and sometimes we just gotta trust we're doing the right thing. In the end, we're the only ones who can decide that for ourselves.
Hey, it's KBash. Huge thanks goes out to my $4 patrons. Check them out. Beautiful. And double special thanks goes to my extra generous patrons who are Adam Welch, Elephant 42, Allsnaps, Arch, Arshwasser, Azura, Axinate, Audra, Bear Skeleton, Basement Dweller, Bearkeeper, Easy Soul, Ben M, Bing Bing Doodoo Oingo Boingo Time, Blake Against the Machine, Wargle Hargle, Bohop, Boom Day, Brios, Brianna Woo, British Gooch, Cow, Can I Cuss on Captain Here? Blasted, Captain Wade, C-Dub, Caesar T, Chiefy Boy, Cordit, Chris Bromo, CLB 5000, Cody Golden, Couch Moba, Crashkers, Crater, Chrono 19D, CW Glassworks, Cynical, Daddy Dago, Dondium, Danny Lavelle, Danny Pangos, Dakota Storm Jones, Stag Swaggy David Castillo, Dara, Dakota, Dennis Amaya, The Strega, Diablo, Dingus Bat, Doug Prince, Dr. Cullen PhD, The Protagonist, Dylan Coffee, 8-Bit Elias, Elpio, Elsa, Emperor Pickle, Eric Monticello, Aesthetico, Everstone Isle, Gnar, Fupa Saiyan, Frankenstitch, Frisky Nippler, Seeker, 9Cat, Goose 6112, Gray, the Darkest Black, Corey, Gucci Plant, Asi Ibrahim Tanyurga, Hatsune Miku's Crack House, Heeman, Game and Station, X-Max, Honeymutts, Horn Tiger, How do you know? Huey. I'm supporting KBash just because I wanted to make this part of the video longer. Ingenious Clown, I punched a sandwich, Irrational, Irradiated Cherries, Dice Kyle, It's not that, It's time to sue, It's not good, Ivy Ruth Langley, Jacob, James, Jason Lasky, Jaden, Jay JK Hedgehog, John Bo the Joker, Joke Frog, Jordan Joyner, Jules DLC, Julian My Julian, KBash's Best K, Keegan Too Cool, Kata Snack, King Kuma, Keej, Kenai Pike, Clock Kong 2020, Rated, Crazy Dark Chocolate, Kumi, Heist, Kyle, KZ Excellent, Lady Dentalian, Lady Weed, Latrix, Laundry Mom, Lego Sid, Lethal Nibbles, Little Big Trouble, Loathsome Dung Eater, Low Fat Moger, Lucas Boy, Lucky McSmucky, Blood Mac James, Lupin the Turd, Magical Madman, Mama Rollin, Manapool, Mara Ganger, Hercules, Mugio, Maximilian Wolfgang Niver, Maple Puppet, Metal Gear Gaseous, Michelle Citrano, Mike DeVere, Milky Moo Official, Mikusagi, Monochrome Only, Modi, Mr. Dodongo, Mr. Whiskey 282, Mr. Yeety Dabface McYoink Bomb, Nairanu, Nito Torpedo, Nico Puzzle Rat, Nurian Daridius, Not Nobel, Nuggy, Old Burgle, Old Man Cranberry, Omni Nerd Zero, Only LK, Plant, Pandemic Cowboy, Pinata, PBK, PK Gaming, Pontus Reddin, Popular Hitman, Potato Gaming HD, Prismatic Dan, Fractal and Pals, Quasar McDougal, Quillworth, Quinn, Radpunk, Reasonable Willow, Reggie Rodriguez, Renteca Bond, Ricochet Framed Relay, Roy Londo, Ryan Maury Brooks, Siren Smells Good, Salty Smasher, Scribe Slendy, Say, Sakai no Award, Sexy Bionicle GF, Shot, Shinigami, Shintendo, Shut Up Wesley, Silver Bear 909, God! Sleepy Wabbit, Slick Tactics, Snark, Sock'em Bopper, Suckdolager, Space Lizard, Spooky Grimalkin, Squidgid, Squishword, Standard Issue Dingus, Star Night Sky, Storm Strider and the House of Storm, Streetums, Sublime Cataclysm, Super Sandwich Guy, Harvold's Quest, George Chubbington, The Big Bubby, The Clown Prince of Cringe, The Digital Dutchman, The Good Lord has blessed me, hallelujah! The Green Loki, The Peacemaker Pyro, The Salt Knight, Dick Mystic, Thrips Heart, Tiggles McGuffin, Tim Lobster, Timid the Writer, Turtle Play, Travis Edwards, Twiddle Chungus, Vid, Valenris, Venom, Vice Pup, Viewers Like You, Vic, Waposa, Weed Trash, Waylon, Where Am I Help? Widgie, Winter Solstice, Win TV, Renchim, Zanny Tanner, Yashichi, Yay Kundo, Your Mom, Winky Zachary Lives, Zachary Zanasso, Zane the Impure, Zane the Pure, Zed Slayer Gamer, Zero Zalazar, Sylvan Ray, Nova, Cyberbunk. If you'd like to help support the show, unlock new long-form projects, and help me keep improving, check out my Patreon. We got lots more videos in store. Stay tuned for more. KBash out.